Here, if I want to get a current, then the exciting energy, or let's say the applied bias, has to be above certain value which will overcome the energy barrier, that is the inner band gap of this semiconductor. So the minimum amount of bias that is required to get any non-zero current in a semiconductor is quite large compared to that of a metal. In the case of an insulator, it is even larger because the band gap is much larger, so the conductivity will be even lower. So if I compare these three classes of materials, then I see a metal has a higher level of conductivity compared to the semiconductor and an insulator. And electronically, we can just see this thing because of the number of carriers that are readily available is much higher in the case of a metal. Now, what happens when, let's say, if I have an electrical conductor and I want to pass electricity. So whenever I want to pass electricity, that means some charge carriers. So it will be electrons mostly. They will try to move from one side to other. However, in this process, let's say if I have a voltage source and I apply that voltage source across a conductor, then the electrons, they will try to move. And in this process, they will get scattered. Now, usually this scattering process is inelastic, which means that these electrons will lose energy. Now, what will happen if they lose energy? It will actually have scattering either with the impurities or with something called as lattice vibrations that are phonons. Now, both of these two sources, they will give rise to something called as resistance. So whenever in an electrical conductor I'm trying to pass a current, inevitably I will have to face some resistance, or the current is bound to face some resistance. Okay, and this resistance in turn will also basically create some Joule heating later on, but a resistance is always there. Now, if I look at the temperature dependence of this resistivity here, so I can see that at low temperature, the resistance is actually okay. So at low temperature, this resistivity stays at certain value, which is, let's say, rho naught. And then if I increase the temperature, then it slowly increases, and at higher temperature, it increases almost by a power law, or let's say higher than a linear behavior. Okay, so at higher temperature, since the number of phonons are much larger, that is why the phononic contribution towards the resistance is much larger here. However, when I am going to a lower temperature, these phonons will be contributing much smaller, and the majority of the contribution towards the resistance will be contributed by the impurities. Okay, so what it means is that at lower temperature, these vibrations or the phonons, they will be frozen out, and we will get something like a residual resistivity. Okay, rho naught. So it will not change much. So this is the case of a typical conductor. However, there is a certain class of materials which can be metals also, not metal, but let's say typically there are certain metals which show this peculiar property that if I cool this material below a certain temperature, then the resistance of that material, or let's say the resistivity, it disappears completely. So this type of material is called as superconductors. So as you see, conductor is the general term, and super means the level of conductivity is very high. So if I look at this diagram here, that is rho versus P, so I can see the resistivity is quite high at higher temperature, and then it slowly decreases. That is the typical behavior of a metal. Below a certain temperature called as this TC, that is the critical temperature, it drops, then it becomes negligible, or let's say theoretically it is zero. Okay, so above this critical temperature, we get behavior that is similar to that of a normal conductor, that is the resistivity is non-zero. But when we flip below the critical temperature, it becomes a superconductor. Now that is very interesting because I mean, if we have electrons and if we have a lattice, then and there are impurities there, so the system itself is not changing. But how is it possible that the material is suddenly showing no sign of resistance? So that we'll look into it later on, that what is the basically origin of the superconductivity phenomena. But the interesting part here is that the temperature is quite important here. So here, only if the temperature is below certain temperature, that is the critical temperature, the superconductivity is observed. Now the question comes, can pass current without losing energy? So what is the low enough temperature? Like how low do we need to go? So here, if I just plot transition temperature or the critical temperature, with on the x-axis I have ER. So here I can see the critical temperature that was basically in the initial years of the superconductivity, it was below 20 Kelvin, and then slowly it has increased, and after 1980, so around 1986, high temperature superconductors are discovered. So the TC value, it increased by quite a large factor, and then the highest TC, it goes above like 120 Kelvin or like 130 40 Kelvin, something like that. Okay. So here actually there are two points which are quite important. That if we want to get a superconducting phase, that means we cannot get it at room temperature, which means that we have to cool the material. Okay. Now, how do we cool the material? We need some cryogenic liquid. So one is liquid nitrogen and other is liquid helium. So liquid helium can give us basically usually below 4.2 Kelvin, or we can even go up to millikelvin temperature. But with liquid nitrogen, which is much easily available, we can go up to around, let's say, 80 Kelvin or 77 Kelvin is the boiling point here. So here, these high TC superconductors, we can still use at liquid nitrogen temperature. It means that the cryogenic cost becomes quite low. But if we want to use some of these elemental or let's say alloy superconductors, then we have to use liquid helium. Okay. Now, if we look at basically the comparison between a normal metal and a superconductor, so here, as I said earlier, that the resistance for the case of a normal metal is mostly contributed by two factors. One is this phonon and other is this impurity. And usually this block and block Brugmansian formula that is used to describe the temperature dependence here. So you can see that there is a factor that is rho 0, which is independent of temperature. That is called as residual resistivity. And that is usually contributed by defect or impurity scattering. And there is this temperature dependent term, and we have this T to the power n term, and that is scaled with theta r, that is dy temperature, which takes care of the phononic contribution. Now, this phenomena of superconductivity was first discovered in the year 1911 by Heike Kamerlingh-Onnes in I think Leiden, that is in Netherlands. And actually, he was not aiming for working with superconductivity, but he has observed that with mercury, whenever he cooled the material below certain temperature, then it was around actually 4.2 Kelvin. He observed that the resistance suddenly disappeared. And that was the first discovery of superconductivity. So as you can see, it is almost more than 100 years that superconductivity first came into picture. And for this discovery, he was awarded Nobel Prize in the year 1913. Now, why superconductivity is so fascinating? This question naturally comes up to our mind. So the first point here is that the fundamental mechanism of superconductivity is actually quite fascinating. Why? Because usually, as I already mentioned, that how resistivity can completely disappear because the system itself is not changing. Okay, like we are cooling the material, and then if we are heating it up, it is going back to the same case. So we don't see any physical change in the material itself. So the mechanism itself is quite interesting. And then here it is usually observed that it is a novel phenomena at low temperature. That also we'll look into it later on. And other than that, it has wide area of applications, like in power storage, then in magnetic levitation, high field magnets. So all the high field magnets are usually superconducting magnets. Then highly sensitive magnetometer, that is squid magnetometer, that is the most sensitive magnetometer available till date. That is also used, kind of developed only with superconductors. Then Josephson junction electronics. So there are many things actually which are only possible to realize because of the presence of superconductivity. And even there are few things which are not mentioned, like even quantum computers or even qubits. Those things also need superconducting state, or let's say some bit of superconductivity is required. Even like realization of Majorana fermions. So in terms of both fundamental physics and application perspective, superconductivity is still highly relevant even after 100 years of discovery. Okay, so now is can we call a superconductor is only a conductor, or let's say perfect conductor? The answer is no. Usually in the case of a perfect conductor, we get rho equal to 0. That means no resistivity at all, which means that the current is passing without any resistance. But in the case of a superconductor, we get that thing. In addition to that, another new property comes in, that is called as perfect diamagnetism. So what is it? It says that a superconductor will expel any kind of magnetic flux when the field is constant in time. So let's look into this. Here is one picture so that you can see that I have one piece of material which can become superconductor if I cool it down. So it is at a temperature above critical temperature and the applied field is 0. Now I am putting it below its critical temperature, superconducting transition temperature, and then I apply magnetic field. So in this case, the applied field actually changes, and what I see here is that the material it actually expels the complete flux, or let's say whatever applied field was applied, the same amount of basically magnetization was created in the material, but it is in the opposite direction. Okay, so as you can see, the flux lines will be completely out of the material itself. Now if I give an opposite scenario, that is the field is already applied above Tc, and then I cool the material in the presence of field, then I will also see a perfect diamagnetic scenario. So no matter what the history is, the state will be independent of the root. This is also called as Meissner effect. So perfect diamagnetism is an interesting and useful property of a superconductor. Now, but why does it happen? Okay, so if we want to look into it, very simply we can get the answer. Because in the superconducting state, the current density is 0, so the electric field will also be 0. And for the case of a Meissner effect, we see that the total B is 0. Okay, now if I use this expression, that is B is equal to mu naught times M plus H, so I'll get M will be equal to minus H. That means susceptibility will be -1. Okay, so in SI or CGS, you can take care of the unit. But here, the useful message we get is that superconductors are perfect diamagnetic materials, which means that whatever flux is trying, basically applied field is present there, it will expel it completely. Okay, and this experiment you probably have seen it either in your real life or on YouTube or some video, that this is this magnetic levitation experiment. Here is a piece of superconductor, and here this is cooled below its critical temperature, and here is a permanent magnet that is being put on top of it. And when it is superconducting, then basically it will completely repel this magnet, which means that the magnet will be floating on top of it. Okay, so that is possible because of this perfect diamagnetic behavior. Now, the superconducting materials can be classified into two basic categories. And this is because of the basis on their behavior with respect to the external magnetic field. So one is called as type 1 superconductor and other is called as type 2 superconductor. So let us look at what are these things. So type 1 superconductor, it is also called as soft superconductor. So they strictly follow Meissner effect, which means that these are perfect diamagnets. So if I look at the magnetization versus magnetic field graph here, I can see that it gives a almost linear slope between the magnetization and field. And above certain field, that is called as critical field or HC, this material does not contain any magnetism at all. So it becomes non-magnetic, or let's say normal metal. Okay, so that is the property of a superconductor, that if the applied field is below the critical field, then it will behave as a superconductor, or let's say perfect diamagnet. But if the applied field goes above the critical field, then it will turn into a normal metal. Okay, but these materials have very limited technical application because the value of critical field is quite low. Now, if we look at the type 2 superconductors, so we get a different kind of phase diagram here. So here, if I look at the M versus H graph here, so here there are three different regions. So one is region 1, then region 2, and region 3. Now, here in region 1, this type of material, it shows Meissner screening, that means perfect diamagnetism, or let's say the magnetic flux is getting repelled from the material. However, if the applied magnetic field goes above a certain value that is called as lower critical field, or HC1, then slowly the magnetization start increasing. Okay, increasing means from its previous value, and if I keep on increasing, then the material started becoming more and more magnetic, and that behavior will go on up to another critical field that is called as HC2, or upper critical field. If the applied field is above HC2, then the material does not stay superconductor at all, or it becomes normal material. Okay, so what happens here is that above HC1, this external magnetic field, whatever is applied, they start entering into the superconductor in the form of something called as flux quanta, or let's say vortices, superconducting vortices. So that I'll discuss a little bit into details. What are vortices, how do they look like, and how they can be measured. So they start entering into the material. So these are basically normal metals. So you can think of it like a superconducting matrix, and within that there are small portions which are normal metal, that means non-superconductor. And if I increase the field, the number of such normal cores start increasing, and when we are going close to HC2, the number of normal cores, or let's say the normal core volume, becomes much larger compared to the superconducting volume. That is why the superconducting state can no longer sustain, and if the field goes above HC2, then this material becomes completely normal. Okay, so that is why we get this kind of phase diagram. Here the useful thing to note here is that there are two critical fields, that is HC1 and HC2. HC1 is the lower critical field and HC2 is the upper critical field. So between HC1 and HC2, we see this vortex state or vortex phase, or mixed state also we can call it. Okay, now these superconductors are also called as hard superconductors because they can sustain relatively large field, and we'll see that how these materials can be used for designing powerful magnets. Okay, so now if I look at what is the response of these superconductors with respect to external magnetic field. So as we explained already, that if an external field is applied and if the field becomes quite high, that is above the critical field, then superconductivity will be completely destroyed. Okay, now what is the temperature dependence of this critical field with temperature? So it actually goes by this expression, that is HCT will be equal to HC naught, that is a constant term, times 1 minus T by Tc whole square. And if I plot it, then I see a kind of power law of behavior. So this is the same kind of pattern which we have seen in the case of a ferro to para transition, if you can remember that here we got some spontaneous magnetization, and then that basically disappears when the temperature goes above critical temperature. Okay, so now here we see that if temperature is 0, let's say very close to 0, then we get the highest critical field, that is HC0. But then if the temperature is increasing, then the critical field it goes down. So basically it does not fall by too much up to certain temperature, but then above certain T, basically the decay becomes quite fast, and above Tc it completely becomes 0. Okay, so this is the dependence of critical field with temperature. Now we'll see. So there is another interesting effect which is usually observed for the case of a superconductor, and it is called as isotope effect. So usually it is observed that the critical temperature of a superconductor it is related to the isotopic mass. So if the isotopic mass is capital M, then m to the power alpha times Tc is constant. But typically the value of alpha comes out to be 0.5. Okay, and this Debye temperature of the phonon spectrum is related to this mass by this equation, that is theta d times m to the power half is constant. So this is an effect which is observed, and whenever any material becomes superconducting, then the entropy also shows some characteristic behavior. So usually it decreases during the normal to superconducting transition, which indicates that the superconducting state is usually more ordered than the normal state. Okay. So now, as I mentioned in the last class also, that usually whenever there is a TC, that is the critical temperature is mentioned or critical point is mentioned, that means that there is a phase transition that is going on. So here also the phase transition that is happening is between a superconducting state and a normal state. Okay, which means that the electrical resistivity completely disappears. So now usually any kind of phase transition, it is characterized by some order parameter. So here also we'll look at what are the order parameters here. Okay, just give me 1 second. So now we'll look into the types of superconducting materials. So initially in the earlier days, the superconductors which are discovered are mostly elemental, or let's say alloys, mostly elemental at that time. So these are like lead, niobium, mercury, aluminium, indium, tin, tantalum, things like that. And later on, people found that niobium is also superconducting. So these are usually having TC around 10 Kelvin or between, let's say, either below 10 Kelvin or let's say, around 10 Kelvin. And then the family of superconductors came, which are alloys or let's say compounds made up of these materials. So like niobium nitride, niobium titanium, and then niobium tin. So they can have critical temperature up to, let's say, 25 or 30 Kelvin. So these materials are commonly used for magnet design. Then, so these are like earlier days of superconductors. Later, actually this is not in the proper order, these high TC superconductors are discovered. So as the name suggests, that they have a higher critical temperature, and higher means they are above liquid nitrogen temperature. So this is like, so this formula is a little bit wrong. So lanthanum has been repeated twice. So like lanthanum, strontium, copper oxide, which is LSCO short form, and bismuth, strontium, calcium, copper oxide, that is BISCO, and then yttrium, barium, copper oxide, or YBCO. So these are the materials which come under the family of high TC superconductors, and they are mostly ceramic. Okay, so they're not metals. That means they are very brittle. So these classes of materials were discovered, I think, in the year 1986, and Nobel Prize was awarded because of this discovery. Because of this discovery of high TC superconductors. Okay. Now, other than this, there are few other classes. So not all are covered here. So I have covered here mostly the interesting, or let's say widely researched one. So there are these unconventional superconductors like strontium ruthenate or magnesium boride. So usually they have a different kind of electronic pairing. Okay, so that is why they are different from the others. But they have a lower TC. So typically in strontium ruthenate it is around like 1.5 Kelvin. In magnesium boride it is quite high, but this is also again kind of like, they don't come under high TC or elemental superconductors. Then there is this phase of family of superconductors which are called as heavy fermion superconductors, like uranium platinum 3, uranium ruthenium Si2, then cesium, cobalt, indium 5. So these are heavy fermion superconductors. So heavy fermions are basically like the isotope mass is quite large. So this is another class of materials, and extensive research was done in, I think, early 2000 to mid 2000. Yeah, like quite a lot of research was done on this thing, because their pairing is quite new, and also the physics is quite interesting. And recently, I think in the year 2008, this new family of superconductors are discovered, and quite a lot of research was done. So this first discovery was made in Japan. So these are called as iron-based superconductors, or the general name of this family is called as pnictide or pnictide. People say both terms. So they are so there are like several phases, like 1111, 112, then 122. So here some of the members of this family are like lanthanum iron arsenic oxide, then samanium iron arsenic oxide, then barium iron arsenic, strontium iron arsenic. So these are the superconductors which were discovered from 2008 onwards. So let's say from 2008 to, I think, mid 2010. So there are quite a lot of materials which are discovered. Now, the interesting part about these superconductors is that usually superconductors are non-magnetic, which means that they don't like ferromagnets. Okay, but here these materials itself, they have some ferromagnetic element itself there, which is, let's say, iron here, so it could be nickel also. This material itself contains some ferromagnetic materials, which makes it questionable that what is actually the origin of superconductivity in general in different materials. Because for alloys there is a particular theory which is available, then for high TC no exact theory is still available, but then there was an usual kind of like common assumption that usually superconductivity is present when there is no let's say strong magnetic environment in the material. But then for the case of iron based superconductors, it is observed that even when iron is there, the superconductivity is still there. Now the pairing of electrons in this all these materials are different, so I'll not be able to cover all of this, but I'll try to have some glimpse on some of these, at least what type of things can be expected. Okay, and here is a complete graph of how TC has gone through some evolution over the years. So as you can see, in the early 1900, when the discovery happened, the TC was around few Kelvin, and then slowly they started increasing, and up to I think 1980, it was around 30 Kelvin or below that, basically below 50 or around 30-35 Kelvin. These are mostly elemental or let's say some alloys. Okay, and from mid 80s, these high TC borides, they are discovered, and as you see, they have higher and higher transition temperature. So the highest something which is so in this cupret family, highest one I think has around 169 or 70 Kelvin. That is mercury, barium, copper, calcium oxide. Okay, so that is and basically the highest TC which has been recorded, I think, in this particular family, that is the cupret family. And then there are these iron-based superconductors, that is the pnictides or pnictides. So they have a TC which is not again very high as that of them, but typically around 50-60 Kelvin, something like that. So you still need liquid helium. And recently, I think around I think 2018 or 19, there was this paper which came out, that is hydrogen sulfide. If you put it under high pressure, then you can get a critical temperature which is about 200 Kelvin. So that is the highest TC which has been reported so far. And but again, it is at very high pressure. So usually most of these materials, whenever you put it under high pressure, you see a tremendous change in the critical temperature. Now here actually different star marks are present here, so you can see some are basically like interfacial superconductors. So interfacial superconductor means that this is not a superconductor itself, but rather there are two different layers of two different materials which are let's say it's a thin film of two different materials. So in the case of iron selenide STO, so it is the strontium titanate substrate. On top of that, iron selenide has been kind of like grown, and this structure itself shows superconductivity. Not that STO will show superconductivity or iron selenide will show superconductivity in this case. Only this particular structure in this particular format will show superconductivity. Okay, so this is actually a nice paper, you can look at it. So only few layers of this material, if it is grown on top of strontium titanate, then only this superconducting property is observed. Anyway, so they also have seen quite high TC, that is around above 100 Kelvin. That is in thin film is quite large. Then this circular symbol, it represents iron-based superconductors, which are basically this part on the right-hand side. And then cupret superconductors are marked by stars, and conventional superconductors are marked by field circles. Okay, so this is an entire family which contains the research of, let's say, past 100 years. So it's quite large amount of research. Okay, so now we'll look into the theoretical aspects of superconductivity. So there are several theories which have been proposed over the years, and they have been used, to explain the phenomena of superconductivity. So different parts have been explained by different things. So first one is the phenomenological theory by London and London. That was given in the year 1935. Then semi-phenomenological theory was given by Ginsberg and Landau in the year 1950. Then microscopic BCS theory was given in the year 1957. So that is the first microscopic theory, and Nobel Prize was awarded because of this theory. So let us first look at, so I'll not get into too much of this mathematics. I'll just show you, and then I'll briefly scroll through it. So in the case of this theory by London, so there actually, it's not the city of London, but there are two scientists. One is Fritz London and let me see this second name. Yeah, Haynes London. So these are the two scientists who have given this theory. So they have started with Maxwell's equation mostly, and they have used the conditions like electric field is 0 or magnetic field is 0, things like that. And from there, what they have found is that, no, wait a second. Okay, yeah. So they have also used the basic equations like force equal to m times a, and current J will be equal to NeV, that is carrier density and electronic charge and velocity. And from there they have got two equations. So one is called as this first London equation, where electric field is explained in terms of the time derivative of the current density, and the second equation they have also derived with using Maxwell's equation. So you can see del cross B dot, and then basically again taking a curl of this. And from there, they have got the second London equation, which is del cross J will be equal to some factor times B. Okay. Now, the important part, the information which you get from here is the following. So here, the spatial dependence of, let's say, magnetic field in a superconductor with distance that we see here, usually it is, let's say, decays exponentially with distance, and that happens over a characteristic length scale that is called as lambda. So if I plot B as function of x, then I see that it decays exponentially as I go away from the superconductor. Okay, so this lambda, this is called as superconducting penetration depth. Okay, so here actually, yeah. So this has been plotted. So here actually there are two parameters which, okay, so let's first look at this graph. This B is plotted as function of x. So as you see, since it is decaying exponentially, so over the distance lambda, it is going down by a factor 1 over e of its maximum value, and then it is decaying slowly after that. And here it is the temperature dependence of lambda that has been plotted, which is basically lambda T is equal to lambda 0 times 1 minus T by Tc to the power 4, and then power of minus half. Okay, so here that means that it also goes through a temperature dependence that is similar to sorry, it's not similar, that is opposite to that of the critical field. So here if I plot it, then I see lambda L, it's actually increases as I increase the temperature. And here there is another parameter that is called as basically Ns, which is the superconducting electron density. Okay, so this Ns, it also decays with temperature. So lambda L increases, Ns decreases. Okay, now why such kind of behavior is observed? So let's say the number of superconducting electron, that is Ns, signifies that what is the total volume of superconductivity, or let's say the more number of super electrons are there, that means the superconducting phase is more stronger, okay, or robust. Now if we are at a lower temperature, that means superconductivity is expected to be strong. But if I am increasing the temperature, that means a fraction of the superconductor will start becoming normal. And if I'm increasing the temperature higher and higher, then above the critical temperature, the material will totally become a normal material, which means Ns will be 0. So usually, if I'm increasing the temperature, the value of Ns decreases. Now lambda L, on the other hand, is the distance which is called as penetration depth. That means the distance over which magnetic field can enter into a superconductor. So here, when the temperature is low, then lambda L is small, and then as I'm increasing the temperature, the lambda L becomes larger, which means that higher the temperature, the superconducting phase is becoming weaker, which means that magnetic field can penetrate higher and higher, which means that it is disturbing the superconducting state. Okay, so close to Tc, it becomes quite large. So that is why we get this kind of behavior. So these are two very important parameters to define, or let's say characterize a superconducting state. So this is the first one, which I said, the London penetration depth. So as I said here, that this kind of tells us the characteristic distance over which the field decays by 1 over e of its maximum value. Then there is the second parameter, which is called as coherence length. So this parameter actually comes from Ginzburg-Landau theory. So I have not derived it here, but actually it comes from that equation. So this is a measure of the distance over which the superconducting electron concentration cannot change drastically in a specially varying magnetic field. So very simple terms, what it says is that it is the distance over which a superconducting phase, or let's say this is the characteristic length scale which defines the spatial spread of a superconducting wave function. Okay, so larger will be the coherence length, higher will be the, or stronger will be the superconducting phase. Now this is a rule of thumb that if lambda is less than xi, then it will be called as a type 1 superconductor, and usually if lambda is much larger than xi, then it is called as a type 2 superconductor. Okay, so this is a rule of thumb. So these are two important parameters, one is lambda and one is xi. So one is called as coherence length, other is called as penetration depth. So these are commonly used to describe a superconductor. Now I'll come to the microscopic theory, which is called as the BCS theory. Now this theory was proposed by these three scientists, Bardeen, Cooper and Schiffer, and this is the first microscopic theory which was given. That means it's kind of like makes use of the microscopic features, and for this discovery Nobel Prize was awarded to them in the year 1972. So what happens here? So this is quite big theory, and I have tried to incorporate quite a lot of information into one single slide. So let us see. So this theory, what it simply says that the superconductivity or the phenomena of superconductivity, it arises due to the presence of an attractive interaction between two electrons. True electron and phonon interaction. Okay, so let us first think of what is electron and what is phonon. So as we know, electrons are basically charged particles, so they have usually a negative charge. What is phonon? Phonon is the quanta of lattice vibration. So whenever the lattice vibrates, phonons are generated. Okay, so higher will be the level of vibration, higher will be the level of phonon, or let's say the density of number of phonons will be larger. Now let us look at the very simple picture here. So you look at this middle diagram here. So let's say we have periodic lattice. That means these are the atoms which are sitting there. Now usually atoms means we are thinking of ion cores which are staying there. Now let's say if there is an electron that tries to move through this lattice, then what will happen here is that, let's say if these red circles are representing electrons, so whenever, let's say, one electron is coming this position, let's say here, then these four ions, they will get slightly attracted towards the electron because the charge is different in these two cases, which means that there will be a slight distortion in the lattice. Okay, now let's say the electron moves, because this electron is transporting, so the electron moves, but whenever it comes here, that means it created a distortion. Okay, which means that eventually a positive charge environment is created here. Okay, now this positively charged environment can attract another electron which is staying at a distance. It means that although this electron did not do any major change to the ions here, but eventually it has invited another electron to come here. Okay, so now you can think of that this electron will go past some of these ions and some all over the lattice, and this electron can eventually follow it, which means that there is some sort of an attractive force that is created here, which is actually coupling these two electrons. And now because ions cannot move, so it is basically the electrons which we will see moving, and these two electrons, in the ideal case, they will do this kind of thing when the momentum of these two electrons are exactly equal and opposite. Okay, so let's say if they're around Fermi level, then basically one is plus k, other has to be minus k, or let's say around k, the value will be has to be around the same value. Okay, so this, because of this kind of involvement of the lattice, is basically the phonons which are acting as a mediator. So whenever, let's say, the electron moves, some phonon is being generated, and we can say that it is an electron phonon attractive interaction that is basically coupling these two electrons. So eventually what happens here is that, as per the theory, that these two electrons will couple together and they will form a pair, so it will become a bound state. So you can think of it as a quasi-particle. So it's not like an annihilation, but rather there are two electrons which are somehow bound together. But remember that if we just leave two electrons, they will not be a bound state because they have equal and opposite charges. So they'll start simply because of Coulomb repulsion, they'll try to repel. But here, because of the involvement of the lattice, these two electrons can somehow couple together, and this is called as a Cooper pair. Now, the most important part to remember here is that once these two electrons are coupling together, it is no longer a fermionic state. Okay, so it becomes a boson. Now, if it is a boson, that means this Cooper pair will no longer be sensitive to this impurity scattering here. Okay, which means that it will not face this any kind of resistance which the electron was facing earlier from the lattice. That is why the resistance, it disappears completely, or let's say we get a very high conductivity of the material in the superconducting phase. And here also, if we look at here, this diagram on the left hand side, let's say we have an electron 1 with vector k1, and then let's say it somehow collides with the lattice here. That means it loses some energy, then it changes its momentum to k1 minus k. And let's say this energy, if it gets absorbed, so this is a phonon which gets absorbed by the second electron, then its momentum will also change. So whatever energy is released by one, the exact same amount will be absorbed by the second one, and that's how it can also couple this. But the main idea is that here two electrons, they are forming a bound state. So now what happens here, let's look at the Fermi surface here. So here you can see that, let's say earlier we said that these two electrons have to have almost equal momentum. So let's say here around the Fermi level, these two electrons were existing. Now because of this interaction, let's say one, it forms a Cooper pair, which means that one gains certain, let's say, momentum. So K will be higher than F, and other electron will have a lower Kf, basically lower K value than Kf. That means effectively, if I look at the K space, because these two electrons which are involved in the formation of a Cooper pair, their momentum gets shifted by some amount. So there will be delta K, or a gap, that will be established around the Fermi level. Okay, so a superconductor is basically a gapped material in the superconducting phase. Now what is the consequence of this? So if I look at it, I'll see around the Fermi level there is a gap which is called as delta, 2 delta. And if I plot this delta T, it's basically a normalized value, that is delta T divided by delta 0, I will get a same kind of behavior as I have seen in the case of a ferro to para transition, that is spontaneous magnetization. So here also I see this actually decays, and above TC I will not see anything. So it says that if the temperature is higher, this gap is basically becoming lower, which means that the coupling basically between the two electrons is becomes smaller and smaller. Okay, or let's say the number of electrons which coupled, or let's say formed Cooper pairs, they are becoming lesser and lesser in number. And eventually, if the temperature is higher than critical temperature, which means that the external thermal energy will be quite large in that case, then the gap will completely disappear, which means that this coupling will be completely destroyed, and the system will come back from the bosonic state to a fermionic state. Okay, so I hope this concept is quite clear. Now another important part to remember here is that, so if we look at this density of states diagram here, so you see that this energy gap, as I said here earlier in the left hand side, here also I see a gap of states around the Fermi level. So that basically confirms this gapped argument which I gave here. Now so we have talked about the creation of a gap, Cooper pair, and yeah, how basically the bosonic state is being formed. So now there are two useful observations here. So one is that since it's a bosonic state, that means that there is no restriction on the number of occupation in the ground state. So if you remember, as per Fermi-Dirac statistics, we cannot indefinitely populate one particular energy level. So there is Pauli exclusion principle which comes into picture. But if it is a bosonic system, then in the ground state we can populate as much as we want. That is why in a superconductor we see multiple Cooper pairs, they will kind of form a macroscopic state. Okay, that is why this bosonic state or the superconducting state becomes quite robust when the temperature is quite low, and that is why we see the macroscopic observation of this state. You can think of, like, if only a certain fraction of the material becomes superconducting, then we will never see a TC, because there will always be some channels which are available which will see, let's say, non-superconductivity. Okay, but it is because this phenomenon is quite robust, that is why we see a very large spread of the superconducting phase over the entire material, and we see a large TC, not large TC, like a significant TC in the material. So that is the first observation. Second point is that here you can think of simply that we have a gap here, and if I want to, let's say, whenever the gap is established, that means this material is superconducting. If the gap is gone, then the material is not superconducting anymore. So higher the size of gap, higher will be the temperature that is required to overcome this gap, right? Which means that the size of the gap is directly proportional to the critical temperature. So as the BCS theory also tells the same thing, that the gap is actually directly, let's say, some factor is there, but it is proportional to critical temperature. So higher will be the gap, higher will be the critical temperature. Or means that if the gap is higher, that means there is more bound, or let's say more number of Cooper pairs that have been formed. Okay, so far I have talked about only electrons and the formation of Cooper pairs. Now, one interesting part or useful part that we have missed here, or we have not discussed yet, that is the spin part. Now, as we know, electrons are spin-half particles, right? So if you think of, like, these are two spins, S1 and S2, and in the last lecture I have explained that whenever we have two spins and I'm coupling them, let's say here it's a bound state. Okay, so let's say if I have two spins, and then I can make a joint state out of it, right? So if I have S1 equal to half, S2 equal to half, then I can have a total S that is basically 0 and 1. So I can have singlet and triplet states. Okay, and this is a simple exercise, I think, which I think yeah, all of you are familiar with. That out of this, if you want to form the different, like if you use simple basis sets, then you can form this singlet state, which has to have, let's say, an odd symmetry. Okay, of respect to the spin part. And for the triplet part, since it is triply degenerate, so we'll have three parts, that is this up up, down down, or up down plus down up. So these three states are possible in the triplet state. So this is the spin symmetry of the spin part even. Okay, so I hope this part is clear. So here what I'm talking about is that we have two electrons, each one is carrying half spin, that is S1 equal to half, S2 equal to half. Now if I combine these two spins, then I can get a total spin of 0 or 1. Now this 0 is a singlet state and 1 is a triplet state. So singlet state I am representing by this one, that is up down minus down up. Okay, because it is antisymmetric with respect to the exchange of these two spins. But the triplet state is symmetric with respect to the exchange of these two spins, that is why it is even. So these three possibilities exist here. Now if this is the situation here, that means that if the Cooper pair, whatever I'm talking about, that can have any of these four combinations, right? Now, so the spin part of the Cooper pair, that actually determines whether it's a singlet superconductor or it's a triplet superconductor. Okay, now both of these types have different properties, and this is again a big part of discussion, so I'll not be able to cover it too much, but simply you can think of it, the singlet part of the, if the Cooper pair is singlet, then it will be called as a singlet superconductor, which are, let's say, iron, lead, all, sorry, not iron, lead, niobium, these sorts of things. And there are triplet superconductors, let's say like strontium ruthenate, things like that, okay, which are basically slightly different. Okay, and like they have a non-zero spin part of this Cooper pair. Now there are, if you go a little bit details into this thing, then as you know that if I want to construct the total wave function, okay, then I have to take care of three parts. So that will be the spatial part, then the spin part, and the time part. Okay, and since the overall symmetry has to be like overall symmetry of the wave function have to be antisymmetric, so I can make any combination of these three so that total wave function becomes antisymmetry. Okay, so for example, in the case of a singlet state, I can have time part, so that is represented by the frequency, because time and frequency is basically same. So the symmetry of the frequency part or the time part is even, and momentum, there is a special part, is even. So even times even is even, times odd is odd. So the total symmetry remains odd. Here, if both time and special part are odd, means this will be even. So singlet odd spin part can give this combination. So you can see like how much degeneracy is possible here. Now for the triplet part, you can have even time part and basically odd special part, or odd time part, or even special part. Okay, so these are the different possibilities that are possible in the if I want to have a singlet or triplet superconductor. So the quantum state can have any of these combinations. Okay. So now, since I mentioned about this energy gap, so how will we be sure about this energy gap? So experimentally, this presence of this energy gap can be realized from the specific heat behavior. So if I measure the specific heat as function of temperature, then I will see the specific heat will show a divergence around the critical temperature. And this is usually possible whenever there is a gap. Okay. So as it says, this energy gap is a characteristic feature of all superconductors, which determine their thermal properties as well as their response to high frequency electromagnetic radiation. Okay. So now there is another useful part which is again quite unique for a superconductor, that is called as flux quantization. So I have mentioned it very briefly when I was talking about type 2 superconductors. Okay, so we will see more details of this thing. So it simply says that, let's say, so let's first say what is flux quantization. So flux quantization means that it's magnetic flux which becomes quantized. Okay, so it is a macroscopic quantum phenomena whereby a magnetic flux through a superconducting ring, it carries a current that can only assume discrete values. That means some quantized values are possible. So if that flux that it carries is phi, then it has to be some integral multiple n times phi naught. And what is phi naught? Phi naught is h divided by 2e. So this phi naught has a value that is 2.07 times 10 to the power minus 15 Weber. So what it simply says is that if I want to have a magnetic field, then there has to be some magnetic flux. And the lowest amount of magnetic flux that is possible is this phi naught. So the lowest amount of flux, let's say the measure of this thing is 2.07 times 10 to the minus 15. Okay, and we will see later that how SQUID magnetometer is actually makes use of this thing. So it is able to measure this single fluxion, or let's say this phi naught. That is why it can it is basically the most sensitive magnetometer that is available till the present day. Okay, so now I'll discuss about this flux quantization little bit more details. So I'll go into the type 2 superconductivity. So here also I'll talk about the vortex state, and here these things will be a little bit more clear. Okay, so this is the phase diagram of a type 2 superconductor. So as you can see, on the y-axis we have magnetic field, and on the x-axis I have temperature. Now, so by the way, am I audible? My voice is clear?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So here on the y-axis I have magnetic field, and on the x-axis I have temperature. So this is basically an HT plane on which I am drawing how the system is behaving at, let's say, for different magnetic field and temperature. So as I explained earlier, that up to HC1 is the Meissner state. That means the internal magnetic field will be 0. So basically repulsion complete. And then when the field is above HC1 and between lower than HC2, then this state is called as Abrikosov state, or it is also called as vortex state or mixed state. Okay, so here it is a mixture of superconducting state and a normal state. Okay, so normal material and superconductor both will coexist. Okay, so here we'll look into this into a little bit more details. So usually in the case of a type 2 superconductor, the magnetic flux is allowed to enter into the sample, but only in the form of quantized rods of flux. Okay, so this is a very useful information. Okay, if we think of a metal, let's say a piece of iron, or let's say copper, or yeah, I don't know, like germanium, silicon, or anything, whenever you are applying a magnetic field, the magnetic field lines just enter. Okay, but whenever we are talking about a type 2 superconductor, first it is diamagnetic, that means it is completely repelling. But once it is entering its door for the magnetic flux to enter, it can only enter through the form of this quantized flux. That means only one phi naught can enter first. If I increase the field, another phi naught will come. So it has to be integer multiple of different flux lines, okay, or these quantized rods. Okay, so let's say I'm increasing the field, so this is the applied field, and many of these flux lines have entered. Okay, so how do they look like? So if I look into this detail, look into individual flux line, then I can see that this has this much amount of flux, that is h by 2e, so it carries this quantum of magnetic flux. Now there is one thing to remember here, is that within these flux lines is basically metallic. Let's say it is normal phase. So there are normal electrons which are present here. But outside it, these are basically super currents which are basically flowing around it. Okay. So it means that if I look into this picture here, so there are these green and yellow lines which are normal cores, and surrounding it there is the superconducting volume. So that's why you can imagine that when I said the field is quite small, that means only few of these lines are present. So if I think of the total volume, the number of lines that are present, this will be quite small. But if I increase the field, then the number of these lines will be much larger. So the total volume of the superconductor will be mostly occupied by this normal cores. That is why the superconductivity becomes weaker and weaker. Okay. So this kind of fixed phase is called a superconducting vortex phase. Okay. So now here, if I look into it a little bit more details, then I can see that the magnetic field, the local magnetic field, it falls down. So at the center of this core, it is actually strong magnetic field, because it is normal material. That means whatever the external magnetic field, it is going through it. So the field will be quite high. But as far I am going from this core, the field is decaying. That is true on both sides. However, the superconducting wave function, if I look at, it has a much higher amplitude in this part where HR is small, and near the core it has the lowest value. Okay, so you can see they are basically having an opposite kind of behavior. Now, what is the spread of this thing? So psi r, the wave function, that has a special spread of the order of xi. So xi is the length scale over which decay, or let's say that can tell us that what is the size of the core here. Lambda is the distance over which the field falls by 1 over e over its maximum value. So that is why you can see the competition between xi and lambda, that tells us what is the strength of superconductivity, or let's say what is the strength of the external magnetic field. Okay, so these two parameters are quite important here. Now you can also simply think of that xi is also a measure of special spread of a Cooper pair wave function. Okay, because the wave functions are actually representing the Cooper pairs. So now we understood that, okay, flux lines are entering into the material, and the material is a mixture of both these phases. So what else is happening here? So there is something interesting happening here, that these vortices, since there is a magnetic field that is, or let's say these are each containing a unit quanta of flux, so I can think of it, some current is also flowing around it. Okay, so these are tiny magnets, so they will start repelling each other. Okay, which means that if they're repelling, that means they don't want to stay close by, rather they would start moving away from each other. Okay, so if I look into this lattice from the top, I will see this kind of a picture. That means in order to maintain most equilibrium position of the flux lines, they will order themselves into this kind of configuration. Okay, so they're periodic, and they're probably forming either it's a triangular lattice or it's a hexagonal lattice, things like that, depending on the material. Usually it's hexagonal. They will form some periodic arrangement. So that is why this is called as a vortex lattice. Why lattice? Because lattice means the periodicity. Okay, in a solid, why do we call it a lattice? Because atoms are basically positioned at certain lattice coordinates. Okay, so here also these vortices, they order themselves into a triangular vortex lattice. Okay, now how do we get to see this thing? Okay, so if I thought the local internal field distribution around it, then I will get something like this. So here I will have a peak or large magnetic field around the cores of this, and that will fall because there is superconducting volume in between them. Then as soon as I'm getting to the next one, then I'll see a very high field and so on. Okay, so it is like a hilly landscape. You can think of like sharp mountains, and then there are some flat land or some plateau in between them, and then it is going there. Okay, so that is what happens when I'm applying the magnetic field perpendicular to the plane. So basically field is applied in this direction. So this local internal field has this kind of distribution. Now there are ways to determine this thing. So one way of looking at it is called as so basically there is something called as neutron scattering technique. So as you know that neutrons are subatomic particles and they have a spin. Okay, so as you know that X-ray is used for crystal structure determination. Similarly, neutrons can also be used for that, but neutrons also have magnetic moment. So if you can polarize the neutrons, they can also give you magnetic information. Okay, so here usually the neutron scattering experiment one can do, and it is very popular among the superconducting community. So they have typically these thermal neutrons, they have a wavelength that is of the order of h by m times v. So v is basically again coming from the energy that it has. So let's say if these neutrons are being passed through this, then they will form a scattering pattern, and that will show me some bright spot and some, let's say, not so bright spot and some dark region around it. So that will tell us what is the exact symmetry of the lattice. So I can exactly identify what are the positions of this normal cores and what is the position of, let's say, what is the symmetry, whether it's triangular or hexagonal or square, things like that. Okay. Now, where are these experiments done? So I'll just show you some picture here. So these are some picture which is taken from some beamline. So these are like some neutron beamline. As you can see, there are basically very large amount of instrument which are kind of like, there are large magnets and then beam aligner, multiple things are there. And these are basically tubes through which probably neutron beam tunnel, things like that. So these are like large scale facilities. So we have, I think in India, in BRC we have, and yeah, outside like in European countries and in US, there are many such facilities which are available, but these are quite expensive to maintain. But the idea is that because as you know, neutrons cannot be readily produced. Okay, so usually we get a pattern like this that will tell us that it will mimic the exact shape of the vortex lattice. Okay, now these are the picture which I explained if I am considering the lattices as single unit of flux lines, but it is not always the case. So there are these high TC superconductors which are layered materials, which means that there is, let's say, one layer, then next layer, next layer. So it's like one layer of, let's say, calcium atom, copper atom, lanthanum atom, things like that. Okay, so there this vortex structure, it changes because these are called as like layered superconductors. So there, how do the vortex structure looks like? So let us have this. So here we have superconducting planes, and these vortices, these are called as pancake vortices. You know, pancake, like it's like a flat bread kind of thing. Okay, so because it is 2D kind of thing, that is why they're called as pancake vortices. Okay, so these are superconducting planes. On top of that, we have pancake vortices. Now, if I want to think of it overall, then I can think of it as a large vortex, but usually they are confined to each of these planes. Now, earlier I have talked about on repulsion, but this repulsion could be of different nature, or there could be attraction also. So let us look into it. So first is that interlayer repulsion, which means that these are from two different kind of like, let's say, vortices which are repelling each other. Okay. So it went and then it moved back. Then there could be interlayer attraction. Okay. So here they are like one layer and the other layer. So they're kind of attracting towards each other. So this is called as like electromagnetic attraction. Next, there could be pinning, which means that the vortex, it moves and there is a pinning that could be because of some defect or some impurity, and then it cannot move back. Okay, so the flux lines get trapped here. So these are different phenomena which can happen. Then because of these interactions and pinning, it can lead to irreversibility, which means that wherever vortices are supposed to stay earlier, they could not come back. Okay, so let us look at this. As you can see, earlier the vortices are like this. Now they moved and somehow they get pinned and then they do not come back to their original configuration. So if I look at the pinning landscape, then they can look something like this, that these pancake vortices are randomly distributed over multiple planes, and that kind of give rise to different kind of scenario. So here actually, earlier I said only vortex lattice, but rather because of this pinning, it can lead to something called as a glassy phase. Okay, because the scale of disorder, it increases. So that is also something called as thermal disruption and melting. So again, thermal energy can hamper this thing. So as you can see on the left hand side, I have a perfectly ordered vortex, and on the right hand side, the vortices are somehow kind of like ordered, but around a mean position. So they are falling, they are not exactly falling around a straight line, but rather they are kind of slightly displaced with respect to their mean position. Now, if I want to have a complete idea of this vortex phase diagram over a field like H, that is the magnetic field and temperature plane, that means at different values of field and temperature, then I can see that there are multiple phases which are possible. So when the temperature is low and field is also low, then usually these vortices, they behave like a proper solid material. So this is called as a vortex solid phase. Okay. Now, if the temperature is low but field is quite high, then this can lead to some glassy phase. So as you know, glass phase is something which is intermediate between liquid and solid phase. So it does not have a high degree of correlation, and it is not like a perfectly ground state. So it is going through some dynamics. There is some glass transition is happening. Okay. So here also, it is not the exact ground state. It is a snapshot which is taken at a given moment. But if I take the snapshot after some time, then it will change. Okay, so we have to look at the time scale over which this glassiness is happening. And then there is this line, red line, which is called as disorder line. So here we have an ordered state, and here we have a disordered state. So this disordered line separates these two. And then on the right hand side, we have this blue line that is called as a melting line. Here on the right hand side, we have the liquid phase. So here the correlation is much less. So that is kind of a liquid state. Okay. So usually the way you can find it out, like theoretically people calculate 2-body or 3-body correlation functions, and they can see like up to at what temperature and phase, like field they are diverging. Okay. So that is why this entire phase diagram is called as a vortex zoo. And there's quite a lot of extensive research that is being done. And this is quite interesting also. So for different materials, this phase diagram changes, and actually in some cases, this leads to interesting quantum phase transition also. So this material altogether is called as vortex matter, and they have a lot of links to soft condensed matter. For example, like they have pneumaticity, entanglement, viscotics, glass transition, and colloid systems also show this kind of behavior, and they have higher order correlation, things like that. So there are other type of experiments. So there is one specific experiment that is called as muon spin rotation experiment, which is quite well utilized to understand this system. So due to lack of time, I am not showing it here, but there actually you can clearly see the presence of the solid phase, glassy phase, gas phase, liquid phase by estimating different parameters, I mean, related to the magnetic behavior. Okay, so these phases can be clearly distinguished. Okay, so next I'll talk about something called as Josephson effect. So this is again something which is a big application of superconductor. So as we said that in a superconductor we have a bosonic state. Okay, so it means that electrons are not important there. Rather, we talk about conduction in terms of Cooper pairs. These are bosons. Now let's say we have a structure that is a sandwich structure of superconductor, insulator, and superconductor. Okay. So this is a tri-layered structure. Here the thickness of the insulating layer is quite small compared to the superconducting layer. So if you can remember that this is a similar kind of structure which I explained for magnetic tunnel junction in the last lecture. Okay. So now what happens here is that if I apply a bias here, then these Cooper pairs from this side, they will have, let's say, sufficient energy, and they will tunnel through the insulator. Okay, and depending on whether I am applying a DC bias or I am not applying a bias, I will get current. If I let's say look at the behavior of the current with applied voltage, then there are two different effects that are observed. One is called as DC Josephson effect, the other is AC Josephson effect. So in the case of DC Josephson effect, there is no applied bias. That is why, but still we see a non-zero current above I mean at zero, I mean whenever there is no bias. But in the case of AC dissociation effect, we apply a small DC bias and current oscillations are observed at microwave frequency. So if I calculate the current density, I can see I get an expression like J will be J naught times sine delta 0 minus 2 E B divided by H bar. So as you can see, this is the phase part delta 0 that is constant in time. And then we have a time dependent part. So it has to be omega times T, that dimension. So the frequency of this will be 2 EV by H bar. And if you see that if you apply a small voltage like 1 microvolt, then you get an omega that is of the order of like maybe around 150, 500 megahertz. Okay, that is like microwave frequency. So it can also work as a source of microwave. Okay, so this effect was first discovered in I think 1962 by this scientist called as Brian Josephson from UK, and he was awarded Nobel Prize because of this. So this is the structure which has wide use. Okay, so we'll see it later. I will see it now. So let's say actually if we make a sandwich structure out of this junction, that means I have a superconductor, insulator, and superconductor junction here. And on this side also, I have a similar kind of junction here. Basically, they are connected to each other. So you can think of this left arm is a superconductor, and the right arm is also superconductor. And in between that, I have insulator A and insulator B. Okay. And I have an applied magnetic field that is applied perpendicular to the plane of this thing. Now, if I am applying a bias, that means I am passing a current through this. It will be branched out. So there will be JA that will pass through this path A and JB that will pass through this path B. Okay. So ideally it looks very simple, right? So I'm passing a current here. It is basically instead of one path, it is passing through two paths, like specific branches. It looks very kind of like simple or no different from this case. Here, there is no magnetic field. That is true. Means it does not matter whether current is going through this or current is going through that path. If there is an applied magnetic field, then current will basically gain a phase component. So whether it is going that way or that way, that is because of the left or right-handedness, phase will be added or phase will be subtracted, basically. So either it will be gain or lose the phase. Okay. So eventually, you can see that total current will have two components. That is J naught times sine of delta 0 plus E by H bar C times phi plus sine of delta naught minus E by divided by H bar C times phi. And that will give me this expression, that is 2 J naught sine delta 0 times cosine of E phi divided by H bar C. And if I plot this, then I will see a diffraction pattern. Okay, so here I will see there is a maximum, central maximum, and then I will see periodic bright and kind of dark spots. Here the current varies with pi, and it will have a maximum when E phi divided by H bar C is S pi. So S times pi. So S is an integer. So as you see, there is a condition that has been established here. Okay. So this actually tells us that if I is external field or external flux that is determined by B. Okay. If the field is integral multiple of some quantity that is determined by, let's say, H bar C, E, and pi, then only I'll get a maximum of current or minimum of current. Okay. So that property is actually quite useful for extreme small detection of magnetic field. Okay. And this is what is used to design a squid. So some of you, or maybe majority of you, are familiar with this. So squid is something with the full form is superconducting.
Dr. Roy.
Yes.
Just a second. Yeah, I'm Anirban. So we have around 10 minutes in this session. Accordingly, we may have a discussion session also. There are a few questions. So thank you.
Okay. I'll finish it within the next 10 minutes. Okay. Okay. So here the SQUID, the full form is superconducting quantum interference device. So you might have seen this thing. So this is basically a very sensitive magnetometer. So this is the company that is Quantum Design, which actually manufactures this, but it's not their property. And yeah, basically SQUID is only one part of it. So what here we have is that, so basically you can see this is basically a cryogenic part. So I think this is probably a compressor that is kind of like a helium gas based. So it compresses and kind of like get lower temperature, like it kind of close cycle in the gas. So here you put the sample and then you do the measurement and you control everything from the screen. So you don't usually know that what's happening here. But usually within the system, you have superconducting magnets and you have a lot of electronics. Okay, and the squid, of course. So here also we have a squid here that is used to detect the magnetic field. Okay, so here basically okay, so let us first look at this picture here. Here, so here for this squid magnetometer, so we have basically this coil and we have this sample rod. So we have the sample here that we usually keep at the bottom of it. Then we move this straw, or let's say rod, up and down, and the magnetic field is actually applied perpendicular to the plane. Now, whenever there is a magnetic field and there is a magnetic material that is moving, of course, there will be a change of flux and the current will be induced. So the induced EMF will be kind of detected. So here the squid comes. So the squid actually changes detects whatever small amount of magnetic flux that is kind of coming here, and then this basically gets converted into a voltage signal, and there are further electronics which kind of takes care of it to measure this thing. Okay, so that's how basically the squid works. But the main part, why squid has this high sensitivity, that means you can measure up to like 10 to the power minus 6 or 7 EMU. That is because of this squid or this Josephson junction that is present here. Okay, so here actually this is the reason that we have such high sensitivity. That means it can detect even integer multiple of this flux. Okay, so now I'm coming to the end of this talk. So there are three, so I have tried to cover some of the hallmarks of superconductivity. Of course, it is very difficult to cover everything that has been done in past 100 years in 1 hour. So there are three hallmarks of superconductivity. One is the zero resistance state. That means if I cool it below a certain temperature, the resistance completely disappears. Second is complete diamagnetism. That means the material does not or let's say completely repel the magnetic flux. And the third is macroscopic quantum effects, which means that flux quantization. That means if flux wants to enter into superconductor, it has to enter through some particular quantized units. Okay, so that is the basis of Josephson effect or Josephson junction. Okay, flux quantization. Now there are what are the applications? So you can say, so there are quite a lot of applications of superconductivity. So there are areas like energy, for example, power generator, motors, then power transmission and distribution, then energy storage, energy harvesting. Then there are superconducting magnets, which are probably the most popular magnets which are used in, let's say, accelerator, even like in MRI. So as you can see that in every hospital nowadays we have MRI. So this is a big magnet that is like 3 Tesla or above probably. So that needs a superconducting magnet. And yeah, so these are the applications in the area of energy. Then in the case of transportation, so there is magnetic levitation. That is the maglev trains, which were first introduced in Japan, I think almost like 30-40 years back. Okay, and recently I think China has also introduced these trains quite heavily. So what they have is that these trains, they don't run actually like a normal conventional trains, rather they actually floats on the track, which is through the Meissner effect. There is a repulsion. Then electromagnetic powered ships and magnets for automobiles. In the healthcare, we have magnetic resonance imaging, and there are of course sensors like bolometer, things like that. They are of course there. Now there is a question all the cases that there was a lot of hype about superconductivity, that it will completely replace the power transmission or the way our conduction happens in our electric lines, because it is eventually can carry current when there is no resistance. So that will only be possible whenever we will have a room temperature superconductor. But unfortunately, that has not been realized yet. So hopefully in future someday we can have a room temperature superconductor, then possible, and then like most likely that will revolutionize this industry completely. But other than that, superconductors had quite a lot of other use also, like this recent area or like quantum technology, like people are investing, or like many countries are investing quite heavily on this thing, like quantum computing, quantum communication, qubit generation. So there also superconductivity is quite well used. And there is this area of spintronics also, so that I actually didn't cover here. So that is called as superconducting spintronics. So you introduce a superconducting material in a spintronic circuit, and that will do quite a lot of tricks and tweaks, and that can give rise to actually new phenomena and effects. Okay, So there are quite a lot of widespread applications of this thing. So with that, I'll finish here. So here are the few references. So these books by Kittel is an undergraduate book. You can read it. And then ThinkHub is a classic book on superconductivity. And then there are these papers like BCS theory paper. And then there are other things which you can also have a look at. And with that, I would finish it here. And thank you all for your time. And hopefully I am done. I think I have done it within the time given to me. So yeah, thank you all. Now it's time for questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Roy, for your nice presentation. And I have been watching this presentation from the beginning. In between, someone came to my room, but I was so engaged to see this presentation because you have covered the topic from the fundamental and going into the research aspect and going into the application, and then giving reference to the basic books that we have gone through in our graduation time. So I think really this talk is very interesting and engaging. I hope that the participants really enjoyed it. And there are a few questions, Dr. Roy. If you can go to the chat window, also point to that thing. So
okay, I'll go through it. So
the first question is from
in Dr. Suresh Kumar, I think.
Yeah.
Will the change to normal state takes place layer by layer? Okay, so the answer is that, see, not all type 2 superconductors are layered materials. So these are only cuprate superconductors, which are, let's say, high TC superconductors. They have a layered structure. So for them, the picture is different. But other than that, if other materials are, let's say, I mean, there are also like alloys, which are type 2 superconductors. So for them, this does not necessarily have to be layer by layer. Okay, so it is not necessarily have to be like that. Okay, so yeah, provide the PowerPoint. Okay, I'll do that. Okay, power cut. So next question is by Muhammad Minhaz Ansari. Why the conductivity increases sharply in superconducting state when electrons are in Cooper pairs? What is happening next in the material? So why conductivity increases in the superconducting state? Okay, so as I said, see, the conductivity is increasing because there is no resistivity in a way you can think of. So resistivity means basically you are losing energy. Or let's say if you want to, so you can think of it in very simple terms. Let's say from your home, you want to go to your office and there's a huge traffic on the road. Okay. So if you want to go very fast, then you have to run through people. So that means there is a chance of collision, which means that you will get scattered and you lose energy, right? Your speed will be reduced. Now think of if the road is completely empty. Okay, then you can travel very fast. So you can think of it like resistance is completely absent in one case. So that is why the conductivity is increasing. Okay. So yeah, and because it is Cooper pair, that means it is sensitive to this kind of electronic scattering. So that basically gives rise to this. Now, what is happening next in the material? So next means, see, it is, I mean, the superconducting phase actually it creeps into the material. So other than that, the material property in the sense like the atoms are there, of course, it does not become a new material. So the material elemental composition, everything stays same. It's only the electrical conductivity and the magnetic behavior that changes. And simultaneously, since the electrons are paired, so you can understand whatever effects are coming from the electrons. So let's say if you measure the thermal conductivity, or let's say you measure the specific heat. So wherever the electrons are contributing earlier, they also see a change because now electrons are no longer the same like it was before. Okay, I hope that answers the question. Next is collision disappears and conductivity increases heavily. I hope that is a comment probably. Okay, then Dr. Himani asked, how does pressure affect and increase the critical temperature of a superconductor? Usually high pressure causes defects in disorder in lattice. Okay, that is actually a very interesting question. Now yeah, unfortunately I am not an expert in this area, but I can just give some qualitative kind of like argument. So see this material, what they have worked, I think, is hydrogen sulfide, which is, I think, a gaseous material. So probably at high pressure, they are somehow able to stabilize this to a, let's say, more solid like kind of phase. Okay. But in general, let's say whenever you are applying pressure, that means, let's say, we are kind of trying to distort the lattice in a way. Okay, so it will create some sort of stress, or let's say compress the material. Okay, so in a way you can say the electron phonon coupling is also getting affected because of that. So let's say earlier, if the atoms are well separated, now we are kind of bringing them quite close by, something like that. So that can affect the electron phonon collision that was responsible for the generation of Cooper pairs. Okay, so in the good sense, if it helps to basically enhance the electron phonon coupling, that means the number of Cooper pairs will increase by a large number, and then there will be basically much stronger superconducting state, which means that gap size will increase, and also the basically the TC will also increase. Okay, but yes, it is true, usually high pressure causes defects or disorder in lattice. Yes, it is true, but then you have to think of that, what is the elastic limit of the material. So if it is well within the elastic limit, it is okay. But if it is not, then of course there will be permanent disorder or damage, or let's say some sort of like structural changes or damages. Okay. Okay, so okay, I don't see any other question here. So yeah, if you have,
so in the chat box there is no other question. So now I think if the participants, any one of you would like to interact with our speaker, you can unmute the microphone and you can ask questions if you want. So the platform is now for the participants. Okay, so I think the presentation was crystal clear. At the same time, the questions were answered by Dr. Roy very nicely. So and most important thing that we were dot on time. I came to know from Dr. Hussain that in some earlier sessions there were some problems, technical problems. You know, me and Dr. Hussain work very closely, and I went through the comments from the participants, which you actually attend a program where you face some technical difficulty, you will be able to understand how difficult it is. We take it as online, but it takes lots of background work, even for the online platform to work perfectly at that particular pace and at that particular time. So with that keep in mind, I would just request all the participants sometimes to be a bit more patient and allow us to present more beautiful lecture in front of you in the coming time. And I thank Dr. Soumyajyoti Roy. Maybe we will meet sometime physically. And it was a very nice talk, and I really appreciate that you accepted our invitation and graced this occasion with this nice presentation. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you everyone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm leaving here.
Yeah, so okay, so if Dr. Hussain is present, he can take over, or if not, Ritanovo, should I conclude the session today?
Yes, sir. Dr. Hussain is on another assignment, so you can conclude.
Okay. Okay. So, dear participants, tomorrow we will come on time. There will be one presentation by myself, and I will sharply start at 10:30. So I request all of you to join by 10:25. We try to maintain time from our side, unless of course there is a major technical difficulty. So with that, I expect that you are finding this FDP interesting, and we hope that some of you are asking for links and other things, attendance. We understand that, but you know, means I would request all of you to go through the presentations and note down important things instead of concentrating on only the feedback link. That is a request from my side. Okay. With that, so we have come to the closer of today's session, and have a very good day ahead. Maybe it is afternoon time. Have a good night and see you tomorrow morning at 10:25 sharp. Thank you.